The life cycle is what we see here. The life cycle of social movements have to do with really the beginning and emergence that usually takes place based on some catalyst, some initiating event, which can begin a chain reaction leading to a larger social movement. A great example would be the Montgomery bus boycott. We all know of the sort of classic story, Rosa Parks, who was not just a tired seamstress, was actually a dedicated, lifelong civil rights activist. But it was true that her action of not getting up and her on that bus and her action of getting arrested was a catalyst that led to a one-day boycott, and then ultimately a boycott that lasted over 1 year, eventually desegregating buses in Montgomery. And so that idea that there would be a catalyst, a sparking event, then leads to a period of organization, of unification, and then ultimately to action. And that action could take any number of forms. It could be, everything from riots to boycotts to picketing to any number of types of civil disobedience, which we'll talk much more about. But the key is that once there is this action taken, sometimes a prolonged action over a series of weeks, a series of months, then there are a number of different possible outcomes. We could have success, right, where this social movement ultimately achieves what it was setting out to. We could have absolute failure, right? No real change happens. You could have co-optation, where an outside group, maybe an existing interest group or an existing member of a political party, ultimately takes over some of the leadership of a social movement. And there are pros and cons to co-optation. Obviously, you're getting a much more powerful political insider that's going to be able to help out, potentially moving your agenda forward, but ultimately you're going to lose some control of the social movement itself if it is co-opted. So that's one common outcome of social movement activity. You could have repression, and often there's repression, and sometimes that repression by political or social elites is very successful at minimizing the impact of a social movement. And finally, you could have the ideas of a social movement become more mainstream. A great example recently would be the Occupy movement. A lot of people suggest that the Occupy movement was flawed or failed in what it was trying to do, but the ideas that it came about with, most notably the 99% idea and terminology, is something that is now commonly used in political dialogue. So that idea, that sort of mainstream shift of ideas, is something that is a very important and potentially very impactful outcome of social movements. But ultimately, regardless of which one of these outcomes ends up happening, they dissolve. These social movements end, and ultimately only afterwards can we look back and really say how successful that they actually were. Some social movements have very charismatic leaders, some do not, right? We know of Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Mario Savio from the student movement in the 60s. There are a number of great examples of this, but there are other movements that have less defined leaders. Ultimately, regardless of the leadership or lack thereof, there are these main characteristics that most social movements share.